day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today, I would like to address you just briefly in regards to the concept of personal identity and personal dominion and personhood. The reason why I want to talk about this is because I want to reference the social dilemma of accepting and tolerating transgenderism. I know that it is a hot button topic for a lot of people. There are many people that are easily outraged just by talking about the concept. And I just want to address it from my perspective of how I see transgenderism is it solves for the dilemma that is at the root of why people have a problem with transgenderism is because we are stuck in a binary world, and their concept of the world is hard to, how do you fit a transgender person in to society when your entire paradigm is based off of this binary, orientation between male and female. And for your own sensibilities, you can't, categorize a transgender woman or a transgender male into a male or female role, because your concept of how you justify what's male and what's female is based off of, your understanding of what genitalia somebody has. And respecting that it's hard for some people to just do the basic common decency of addressing a transgender person with their chosen orientation. I get it that there's a lot of people that have the argument that it's compelled speech to have to use pronouns that are chosen pronouns for an individual. It's reasonable to argue from that position, but when you look at the wider context, the greater liberty that is being infringed upon is the liberty of the individual to be as they are, come as they are, be who they are. So, their personhood is being rejected and denied and, constrained and conformed into this binary choice of male or female that is, argued from the point of your genitalia determines whether you're male or female. And that's a very limited experience for individuals, especially because, humans are naturally androgynous. The universe is naturally androgynous. So we have both masculine and feminine orientations, and the idea that, based off of your genitalia determines whether or not you are masculine or feminine is really rejecting the truth and reality of our androgynous state. And some people have more, sense of feminine qualities. Some people have more sense of masculine qualities. I myself in my life have always had, a combination of masculine and feminine. I'm a carpenter, for Christ's sakes. I build things with my hands, and this is traditionally a male role. But I love to dress up in dresses and, be a woman and embody that divine feminine energy. But at the same time, I have no problem with, picking up tools and working on a vehicle, or, building something and constructing something, lifting and carrying heavy things. These are, in society's social construct, traditionally masculine traits. And so, but I identify as a woman. My chosen pronouns are she, her. And the fact that, I do masculine things doesn't mean that, I'm trying to be a man when how I identify is as a woman. But that doesn't prevent me from doing masculine things or manly things. But if I did choose to, lean more into my masculine, energy, I could choose to ask people to reference me in the masculine form, because that's more what my orientation is. And that's what I see transgender people are doing, is saying, like, I know that by, considerations of my genitalia, I may come across as being female or male, but that's not who I am inside, who I know myself to be. I choose to, show up in the world in this way that maybe doesn't directly reflect, the scientific orientation of, what we have, determined is, a male or a female. And so it's not reasonable to say we cannot engage in polite conversation with one another to, address a person by their chosen pronouns because of, some need to adhere to this, basic concept of, what is a man and what is a woman. I think that the greater liberty that we need to respect is, not being so tied up on, compelled speech by addressing somebody by their chosen pronoun. Because, yeah, that is an infringement on your liberty, a little, in a small and minor way that you could, make a mountain out of a molehill about, for sure. People certainly do that. But the greater liberty that's being infringed upon is somebody not being able to show up and be who they know that they are, And I think that in the compelled speech paradigm of it is more like, polite conversation, It's just how to be polite in conversation with others. And, it doesn't harm you to address somebody as to who they are, but it certainly does harm the other person if you intentionally, out of disrespect, refuse to address them for who they are, how they choose to show up in the world. It does psychological harm to those people because you're creating a conflict within themselves of knowing who they are and how they're representing themselves in the world, but the world is telling them, no, don't do that. Don't be that way. You can't be that, because it's, uncomfortable to our sensibilities because we've been trained in the brain to, only reference you as a man or a woman if your genitalia is, as such. And so we have to let go of some of our needs of, being, at liberty to say whatever you want, to, provide for the securities of the greater liberty of being who you are, being true to who you are. And I think that it's not unreasonable in civil society to allow people to show up as they are. And so I think that it would be really a good idea in society if we could just address the concept of personal dominion, which says, I should not have to be, forced to, not be true to who I am just to suit the comfortable sensibilities of people who make it a social, moral dilemma in their head as to whether or not how this person chooses to show up, whether they wear makeup and, wear a dress, whether or not the genitalia between their legs matches what society has conformed in the head that, would be appropriate for one to wear a dress, To me, it's just like, that's just a weird sensibility. It's unreasonable, to compel people to change who they are as a person in order to suit the sensibilities of people who refuse to keep an open mind about, how we are as a people, the many variations of personality and character and, chosen identity. you know, somebody who's rejecting transgenderism based off of some sense of, you know, uh, needing to have the binary male and female in order to fulfill their religious moral ideologies, to the point where they're willing to strip away another person's liberty and rights so that they can't be who they are, even though who they are doesn't actually harm anybody, but not being who they are certainly does harm them. That's an unreasonable relationship in society. And if we look at it in, you know, a different context, it's kind of like saying to an individual who is African American that you can't be black because we have determined that, you know, that the way that your skin is, that how it, you know, what color it is or whatever, is not black enough. And so you can't call yourself black, even though, you know, your sensibilities and how you show up in the world and your cultural identity, your relationship to others, all of that says you're a black person, you know, and you take pride in that. And you have love for your roots and your culture, and it's something how you choose to show up every day, and it gives your life meaning and purpose and fulfillment. But society outside says you can't call yourself a black person because you're not black enough. And that somewhere there's this, like, you know, skin tone measurer that says, you know, if your skin tone doesn't meet this threshold, you can't be considered a black person. And that's unreasonable, right? Especially because, you know, at the end of the day, it's not really, the color of your skin doesn't really matter. What matters about it is your association, your culture identity, your personality, your character traits, what it means in terms of, like, this is how I'm showing up in the world, how I'm orienting myself to other people in relationship. Like, that's literally what it's about. It's not about the blackness of your skin. It's literally about, you know, your being and becoming, and, you know, being as you are and showing up in that way. And so it's very similar on the lines of saying, you know, that somehow society says that we need to be able to check to see, you know, whether or not your genitalia reflects something, you know, like, you know, that we would say is male or female or whatever, and you must conform to which, you know, silo we throw you into, and you can't be anything other than that which we have determined for you is who you are. You know, the next thing you're gonna do is whip out some measuring rod and say, you know, you can't be considered a real man if, you know, your private parts aren't of a certain size, shape, and form, you know? And that's on the same level of unreasonableness in terms of, like, why society thinks that they're justified to, you know, check whether or not someone is a girl or not to determine whether they can play a particular sport. Which goes in the whole thing that I was thinking about today that kind of, like, drew on this. Is like, I saw a really great bumper sticker that says the only trans agenda is just a average life expectancy. And it's like, that's reasonable. It's to say that, you know, they want to be able to be free to live as they are and not have society deny and reject them so much to the point where, like, just their existence is so painful that they would want to commit suicide and end their life because they're not really actually living. And this is a real thing for transgenders. It's hard for them to show up in the world, but, you know, the world says don't do that, don't be who you are, but everything within them, it compels them to, that's who they are and how they need to show up in the world in order to be right within themselves. So society is forcing them into this, you know, dilemma and this conflict of identity. And that's a struggle. You're, like, creating a psychological traumatization of these people that's not necessary. does nothing to, change society and make it better in any way, but it certainly does harm society because it's harming the individual. And so it doesn't make sense to me why we would create an atmosphere for which people feel it's forbidden to be who they are, and that they have to hide that or reject that part of themselves, and create this whole dilemma in their head of identity that then creates unnecessary psychological, disposition towards being unwell. And society should just let people be as they are. And in terms of like this whole sports thing, I really believe that it's reasonable to want to have the distinguishment between, girls and boys, teams and whatnot, because it is a measure of, determining, our capacities and capabilities and whatnot in sports. That's one of the reasons why we have sports, is to, challenge and, exceed, the measurement of the aptitudes and capabilities of individuals. And so it's reasonable to want to orient between a division between, someone's physiological, constructs and build and things like that, to want to distinguish that as being, separate, so you can have an edge of quantification to be able to measure, somebody's capacities. Reasonable to want to do that. But there's plenty of people who are transgender who take, chemical altering, medications that help to make their bodies respond more masculine or more feminine. And in that regard, don't you think that's something that we should also be measuring for? Because then we're understanding the true capabilities and aptitudes of the human body, to say, like, given a different arrangement or different, conditions, maybe it's capable to do more things. And this should be something reasonable that we want to distinguish. So I think that the solution would be to have a tritary approach to sports, where we have boys and we have girls and we have everybody showing up as they are. And in that way, like, we don't have to shame or blame or, beat people down or to force them to reject their own personal realities, or choose not to participate in sports, even though they're compelled to do so. It's giving us that tritary distinguishment and putting it out there in a sense of like, we don't want transgender people to have to live in this, personal conflict of where do I fit in, where do I belong, or for people who, maybe don't want to, just be measured, based off of their genitalia, of their capacities. Maybe they want an even playing field, and considered, like, maybe what you think that is only a thing for girls or only a thing for boys is really just for freaking everybody and whoever can do their best in it. And a tritary approach to sports helps us to achieve that, and it's not unreasonable to, in society, want to have a tritary approach to, our public bathroom facilities. A lot of it being as, first of all, I don't think our bathrooms should be, public, cattle herding into, one silo or another, and multiple stalls of people all doing a very private thing together. Like, that whole concept to me is highly disturbing. And I think that it goes into the whole thing is like, we shouldn't be involved in people's private business, and we shouldn't be doing private things together. And we should have individual, bathroom stalls that anybody of any gender can go into. I think that solves for the problem of worrying about, whether a predatory man is going to go into a restroom and abuse a little girl. Like, you don't have to worry about that when it's a private individuated stall. You know what I'm saying? And I think a lot of those type of solutions kind of weed out the problem of, what society is struggling with in terms of accepting transgenderism, at the social scale. And then also solves for the fact that, this isn't a question of whether you're a girl or you're a boy. It's, really just about, how you choose to show up in the world and represent that in a way that is true and authentic and in a positive social accord with people. Like, we don't need to make this a point of contention. We don't need to make this be a thing of like forcing people to reject who they are. It's really about finding a even, position from which we can all come to agreement with. Is like, we should really be respecting everyone's personhood. That is a part of personal liberty. That's a part of freedom. And we need to just respect that. And yeah, that means because we're all different, we're going to have to find ways to come together with one another that's reasonable and conduct ourselves in polite conversation and be tolerant and accepting and realize that it really isn't a personal offense that somebody else chooses to show up in a certain way. If you're offended by it, that's really something within yourself that is triggering this discrimination. And maybe you should do a little investigation as to why you have that sense. Don't be bigoted about it and hold, fast to these ideals that are, when met in the, face of reason, doesn't even come out in a reasonable way to say, like, it's not reasonable to tell other people that you need to not be true to who you are because it's the only way I can be true to who I am, in a sense of my acceptance of whether or not you are, a male or a female. It's much more important to make sure people show up as they are without others telling them what to do, what to think, what to feel, and from that position of mutual respects, we can come in and say, I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for, society to create in the minds of individuals a conflict of identity to the point where, they may think that there's something that they're not, but they're just following a fad, which I do believe that there is some of that happens, in our impressionable youth who see others who are like, I'm transgender, or, I'm a part of the LGBTQ community, and wanting to find a sense of belonging and identity, they'll, adopt those characteristics and those traits and those tendencies that maybe isn't actually aligned with who they are as an individual, but just rather they want to fit in with the crowd and belong, and it's the new thing, and so they're following it. I definitely am aware of those sorts of concerns, but to me, the solution to that isn't to prevent people from being able to be a part of that community and live out through that and try it out. Maybe they do belong, and they don't know yet because they haven't tried. I don't think that we should prevent those sort of things from existing, but I do think that the solution to it is to give everybody an understanding of, like, part of your life experience is to discover who you are. Try out new things and be those things, but do so because you feel it's what's right for you. And it's a polishing of your personality. It's a, formulation of your character, and it's establishing your soul print integrities of, like, this is what I stand for. And, trial and error, and say, like, yeah, that it actually doesn't feel in alignment with what is right for myself when I show up in the world. And maybe I am doing that because other people do it that way, and we learn through imitation, certainly, but, that doesn't seem like that's actually where I belong. Or they try it and they're like, wow, I feel so fulfilled and accomplished as a person when I live out this way. I feel this is the best way possible to live and show up at the world. And I'm living my bliss every single day showing up like this. I'm glad that, I leaned into this sensibility, like, this is where I belong. This is who I am. This is how I need to show up. We shouldn't be preventing people from exploring that and taking on those identities, because that's how they find their truth and to be able to live out the best truth that they know. So I think that the best way to solve for, the worries and concerns of impressionable minds being, led into something that maybe isn't conducive to their good health and well-being is to establish a firm foundation of understanding in society that part of our job here is to self-develop and to, create, personal development to establish our identities and who we are, and for that to be authentic and true and not based off of what other people tell you should be or other people have convinced you to become. Like, really do what's right for yourself because it's the right thing to do, and listen to that voice of conscience that you have for yourself. I think this is a more reasonable way to approach our social paradigms with one another. Far better respecting that personhood of an individual. Like, this is who I am as a person. And this is how I have established myself in relation with the outside world and others. And this is what is conducive to my well-being and my sensibilities. This is something for which I can live out of with confidence, and it's resonant with my soul. Create the understanding that everybody's meant to pursue that, and then we're giving safe space for everybody to show up and be as they are. Come as you are. And be less concerned about whether or not somebody else's conformities are in alignment with your sensibilities. And to not try to force people into these binary silos that really just go against the natural order of the universe, which is naturally androgynous. Like, it's okay to say, you're a girl. It's okay to say that you're a boy. It's okay to say that you're neither. It's okay to say that, while your genitalia may be that of male, like, you believe you're a female. And to live out of the experience of being female, because, your genitalia does not have to be the determining factor of your entire existence. Very much like your skin color doesn't have to be the determining factor of your entire existence. Those sorts of discriminations are just limitations on our humanness. And I really think that we're doing a disservice to humanity as a whole when we carve out those sorts of distinctions and then hard line discriminate against any variation from that. Because, that rejects the whole concept of evolution. Why evolution is so beautiful and brilliant and practical and it just works is because of the variation and the differences. That's what brings the resilience and the reinforcements that helps with the continuity of, the species. What if we are going through this transition that's requiring us to better embody our masculine and feminine energies so we're more balanced as a people, and that, the whole controversy and argument of transgenderism is really just the social manifestation of this, species dilemma of how do we come back in accord and balance with this, balance of the masculine and feminine energies. And that realizing that the impediment to that really is this social constraint that's based off of, the sensibilities that have been developed over time of our way of life or ontology, that has prevented us from actualizing our fullest potential because it refuses to allow us to express anything other than what the social construct has deemed is right or wrong, male or female, these sorts of things. So I think this is a social manifestation of evolution trying to wake us up to the reality of, like, we are androgynous and we need to embody that in a balanced way, which doesn't mean that you're 50% male, 50% female. Balance is not about equal portions. It means the appropriate combinations of different things. That's what evolution does, is it says you have the perfect mixture of all of the elements that you need in order to be represented and expressed in this unique capacity that is, necessary in the world. Your existence is vital and important to the grand scheme and fabric of things, and that you are part of our advancement of evolution. Like, everybody belongs, right? And those differentiations of expression help us to better understand who we are. And as we study in the free reign space of, we're not trying to constrain things and force them into a certain way so that we can, do some sort of eugenic, perfection of the race or something like that, but rather like the free flow growth and development, and then understanding like how those differentiations are resilience and good for the good of all, I think of it just like in the terms of my personal self, myself considering myself to be androgynous. I'm definitely a woman, but I have masculine energy within me as well. Like if I didn't have that capacity within myself, I would be less capable as a person. I wouldn't be able to do carpentry. I wouldn't be able to, you know, lift heavy things and work with my hands and not afraid to get dirty and do dirty work and these sorts of things, because I would have to represent the, you know, soft, pretty little thing that society has said this is what makes a woman, sort of thing. I like to embody all aspects of my identity, and I'm a more capable person. I'm more able to be self-sufficient and self-reliant, self-determined, because of the fact that I have the capacity to take care of myself. I don't need a man to do these things for me because I just got it myself, you know? And I think that there's many aspects of, you know, men that I have met that have, you know, embodiments of feminine traits and qualities, then unfortunately they reject that part of themselves because society is really harsh on men to have to show up and be manly, and this is what it means to be a man, and the whole manosphere thing is just a toxification and really is a constraint on you know, the masculine energy in the world, to prevent it from being able to achieve that balance, which would help them to be, you know, superhuman, so much more than what they could be without that equaling, you know, orientation with their sensible, you know, masculine and feminine traits, being in accord with like this combination and this way of showing up is actually a true representation of who I am inside, being authentic, not saying that I can't be, you know, empathetic or sympathetic or compassionate because I'm a man. You know, it reminds me of one of my favorite YouTube videos, which is talking about Aragorn being, you know, the perfect representation of the, you know, true man, in the sense that he doesn't have toxic masculinity to the point where he can't express the softer side of himself, the, you know, emotional aspects of himself. He can embody, you know, all of it, and it doesn't make him lesser of a man because he is tender and he's compassionate and he has empathy, that he cares for others and he loves them, you know, and he's supportive of them. These sorts of things doesn't mean he's less of a man. And I think that, you know, that right there just proves the struggle. I think it's harder for men to show up in the world because they have to be, you know, so conformed to, you know, being violent and abusive and these sorts of things. And somehow that's how you prove your manliness, is if you're willing to, you know, fight others and, you know, whatnot. When in reality, what being a man is your capacity to be a protector and to be a respectful role model and to teach others how to respect others. And, you know, that's what makes a good man. And, among other things, but like the fact that society tries to teach this whole manosphere thing where it's like, you know, exploit women and, you know, bully people who you perceive as having weaknesses, and you know, reject other people's sensibilities of who they are, and, you know, force them to bend to your will, like violence and, you know, bullying and terrorizing. Like the manosphere is teaching young boys to be that way. And I think that that's another one of the manifestations of, you know, the social manifestations of this social, you know, and humanistic dilemma of, you know, reconciling the masculine and the feminine energy so they don't become too excessive in ways that actually become destructive to our species and destructive to our social accords with one another, you know, to the point where it expresses in dangerous ways when you get people in positions of power that now create laws that try to say we only recognize two genders, and like, but that doesn't actually conform to the realities of the situation. It doesn't conform to our scientific understanding of what is gender. It doesn't conform to our scientific understanding of, you know, the psychological aspects of differences and variations of personality and character. You know, it doesn't even conform to the reasonable sense of like how our genes are expressed and whatnot. So, to have somebody come in to create a law that's confining, restricting people's someone's personhood, to either fit in this silo or that one or whatever, is really denying our capacity to grow and evolve and flourish and to solve for these, dilemmas that are manifesting themselves in these social ways where we have an abundance of, toxic masculinity, and then we have this abuse of, people and rejection of transgenderism. It's, I think, part of the same, consideration that we have to be able to reconcile. And I really believe that the whole thing comes down to, we need to reconcile the androgynous state of the universe and the masculine and feminine within ourselves, and find the right balance that suits our who we are as a person, and to create safe space for everybody to be able to do that. So I think that that's really the dilemma that is there, and the whatever arguments that people say as to, whether they're for or they're against people being able to choose to be transgender or not, or, if they're for or against people being able to be toxic men and have no consequences for their, bad behaviors and their, lack of being able to have polite conversation and things like that. It all comes down to, like, we really need to get a grip on how to help people orient in society in such a way where we understand the dualistic polarity aspects of masculine and feminine energy in the universe, and that we are embodiments of that, and that it's not going to be an equal portion for everyone, because that diversification, that variation, is actually how we're distinguishing our personal existence in contrast to others, which is our identity in our personal, way of being, our personhood. And I think that if we were to create laws that, are in the realm of, this type of like social accord with one another, it should be about personal dominion, to say, rather than you can't be anything other than what we say, which is the type of laws that the current administration is creating, to say we only recognize two genders, but rather, recognizing personal dominion, which is to say, like, everybody needs to have the free and safe space to be who they are, because it's important that people show up authentically in the world, because that's how we can build trust. We can, people are living out the best truth that they know, then we're living in truth and reality together, the same truth and reality, that we're not rejecting or denying truths, so that we are living from an understanding of what is reality, instead of denying or rejecting it, and letting people live out the best truth that they know, and then be able to learn from one another and role model for one another, and imitate one another, so we can, try out and find best practices for ourselves, so we can self-develop, learning from one another, and this positive orientation of, everybody has personal dominion. Nobody has the right to, unnecessarily impose a will upon you that is outside of yourself. For Christ's sakes, God in religion doesn't even do that, the whole concept of free will. So why does society think that, we can come in and impose, exterior will onto others in such a way that prevents them from actualizing their best version? We definitely need to have laws and rules. So, like, if somebody has a perverted, sensibility within them, which is part of probably some, like, deeply embedded problem that they need to resolve, where they think it's okay, like, how they choose to show up in the world is to be violent and a toxic person and a bully and to cause harm to others. Like, yeah, that's not reasonable and polite society. That's not civil society. And we're trying to develop a civil society with one another, so we can live in social accord, so peace can prevail, so it's okay to have rules to say, you shouldn't be harming individuals. I mean, for Christ's sakes, the Bible itself even says, like, 10 Commandments, golden rule sort of thing, and don't murder others, and these are the things that are expected in a social accord with society. As long as you do these basic simple things, from there we'll proceed a pretty good life for everybody. And so, personal dominion is about recognizing that and putting checks and balances on ourselves to say, like, you shouldn't be able to get away with being abusive to others. You shouldn't be able to get away with, harming others, but you shouldn't, prevent other people from being true to who they are and showing up in the world, especially when it doesn't even really hurt you. Like, somebody's, identity as a transgender person does not harm you, If it does harm you, it's your sensibilities of the fact that you have yet to reconcile this, masculine, feminine, balance that is the natural part of the universe. And so go out and learn about that and figure it out and discover within yourself how to fix that, because, what you're rejecting in yourself is probably just a call from the universe, like throwing it in your face in this way that, like, oh, you're offended by this person. It's just the universe calling upon you to make the corrections and the adjustments within yourself to find balance and accord with your own sensibilities of your masculine and feminine energy. It's not about forcing other people, to make you not have to feel that discomfort of your need for growth. It's a call to better yourself and improve yourself. Consider, well, why do I feel that way? And then think about it like, oh, well, like, what was upsetting about this person was that, they wanted me to call them a she or a her, but, in my brain, I think they're a male. And so why am I conflicting with that? It's like, oh, well, because I don't want people to question my own masculinity. And so it's a, knee-jerk reaction in defense of my own sense of, well, I'm a man, in order for me to be a man, I need, somebody who I share the relationship of man with in, the genitalia sense has to be a man. Otherwise, it makes me feel less of a man, sort of thing. Like, I think that's probably a big problem. A lot of people, why they have problems with transgenderism is their own sense of, like, it somehow, is offensive to their own manhood or something like that. It's like, it shouldn't be that way, and they should do some personal growth in that sense of, like, how other people choose to show up in the world is not a reflection of who you are, but how you react to how other people show up in the world is a reflection of who you are. And you can choose to be a bully, and you can choose to be violent, and you can choose to be rude and mean and, impulsive and knee-jerk reactions and offensive and all these things. You could show up to do that, but that anger doesn't make you more of a man. It actually makes you less of a man, because what you're role modeling is your weakness and your incapacity to be reasonable in a situation, and you're letting your emotions drive you and throw you into overdrive. And you don't have a sensibility conscious in your mind that says, oh, well, logically, it doesn't make sense why I'm offended by somebody else's choice to show up in the world that way. It doesn't make me less of a man. It just means, like, oh, contrast. And then sends a signal to you in your head to say, yeah, you know what? To me, being a man is showing up like this and feeling this way. And that's how I want to show up in the world. Thanks for giving me a contrast to that. Be grateful for it instead of, like, attacking it, sort of thing. So with that, I'm grateful for very valuable time, attention, and consideration in regards to this. I just really wanted to put it out there because I believe that, a social orientation with respecting personal dominion and actually embedding that in our laws and rules that make sure it's like everybody has safe space to show up as they are, is important. And that we make sure that our social ontology, the way that we live, is in the sensibilities of creating safe space for everybody to show up, be who they are. And that our cultural identities should be less concerned about, impressionable minds being, turned this way or that, and maybe that is right or that's wrong, who knows. It should be more about creating safe space for people to explore, an exploration of who they are and discover what that is in an authentic way, instead of being imposed upon them from outside forces, or manipulated into thinking those sorts of things. People should have free will and free thought to discover those sorts of things, safe space to practice and try it out or whatever. yes, reasonably come in and say, it may not be in your best interest and this may have, safety issues or whatever, but you explain it to people in such a way that, for out of care and concern, and then ultimately it has to be their choice to choose for themselves. And that's what personal dominion is about, is making sure that people have the liberty and the freedom to choose for themselves. And I think that we will be able to find a whole lot more social accord with one another if we just come from that sort of space, Understand the personhood of an individual is highly dependent upon their own life choices, how they choose to show up in the world, and it should be respected. And we should create safe space for people to explore and discover that and express it however they choose to manifest it. And our personal dominion gives us this safe space to do that in such a way where you can't have, people acting against you violently because they don't like, how you show up in the world. We need to have protections for that because it really is important that everybody has the freedom to be who they are. And I think that that's solving for a lot of what our social problems are. It's under right now the categorization of talking about, transgenderism and talking about personal dominion and personhood and identity. But it's not just in terms of gender, norms and our conversations about it. It's also talking about personal dominion isn't just about how you choose to show up in the world. It's also your place of belonging, and that you have a firm position from which to stand your ground and defend yourself against those things that would come in and impose exterior wills upon you, force you into conformity and force you to deny and reject your own reality, in a way that would actually create that conflict internalized from a person, because it's that's not what makes sense to me. And then forcing them to just conform instead of finding out how to understand what is reasonable in that situation. And so this is about many other aspects, but it really is about our sociology, our social ontology, our relationship with one another and how we show up in the world, and that need for us to find the right balance, how to create social accords with one another that doesn't create this conflict and this controversy and this negative orientation with one another, because we're not trying to boss people around and tell them what to do and bully them and treat them like shit because, they have been kept in some category of distinction that society says those are people that it's perfectly fine to abuse and, take advantage of and manipulate and to belittle and to, force them into complying with a certain way of being, because stepping out of that line is not okay because, it doesn't match up with our sensibilities of how we would choose to show up in the world. If, that this is what is sensible for us, it's perfectly fine to dialogue and talk about those sorts of things. Nobody's preventing you from talking about it, but we should be doing so with polite conversation. It's not unreasonable to, somebody says, my pronouns are she, her, hers, please address me as such. And in polite conversations, it's okay, she, her, hers. It's not hard for me, it's not a moral dilemma for me to address you in a way to which you have distinguished this is respect for me. This respects my personhood. Oh, okay, that's reasonable. It's just like saying, in the same respects, my name is John and please address me as such, but then everybody calls him Bill. That's disrespecting John and denying John's existence and trying to force John to be a Bill when he's never been a Bill, never will be a Bill. It's who the hell's Bill? I'm confused in the conversation. Who are you talking about? It's very much on the same lines as that. So I think that in terms of addressing a social accord, we should really be, all about finding a way to come into a respect of personal dominion and personhood and, personal liberties to show up with your identity and how you choose, and find the right orientations that's respectful of everybody, and safe space. With that, I'm grateful for your valuable time, attention, and consideration in regards to this matter. With that, until next time, be well.